this might be it. David's unfortunately had a family bereavement and is away for another week probably. Ross has had put in a emergency management exercise today when he thought there was nothing on, so unfortunately he's not here. Justin's away. Have not heard from Rogan and not heard from Jonathan either, so let's get underway. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Bernie, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your time today. We're here with the purpose of discussing the Local Government System Improvement Amendment Bill. Our purpose today is to provide an overview of the bill, to facilitate discussion and to gather your feedback about whether Council should make a submission on the bill. So what we seek from today's workshop is to confirm Council's direction on that, and if you agree, to submit key points that you would like included. We have included, with agreement, the Antisocial Road Use Legislation Amendment Bill at the end of this quickly. Submissions have also opened on that, and we would also seek your guidance on whether Council should submit on that. So in our triangle, we are in the see and do sections so that you see the key issues and, as mentioned, seek that you give us direction and your ideas. So the Local Government System Improvements Bill. The objective that the government has set out with this bill is to help address the cost of living concerns. The rationale for the bill is copied here from the front of the bill. And there's a lot of words on some of these slides, but I will read them out to give the context. So the rationale: when councils were consulting on the current long-term plans, rates were identified as a driver of household inflation. Rates had risen the fastest in 20 years and were forecast to rise again by an average 15%. Rates rises were being driven primarily by rising council costs, particularly for critical infrastructure. However, the government is concerned that rates rises are being exacerbated by a lack of fiscal discipline among councils, including spending on activities that stray from core services, spending more than necessary on basics, not taking advantage of the full range of funding and financing tools available. And with this, the bill is intended to help address the government's concern about a lack of fiscal discipline among councils, as well as ongoing public concern about the high cost of living. And to that end, the bill proposes a range of amendments to the Local Government Act 2002 to meet those policy objectives. The content of the bill itself is in 5 different areas. To reduce the pressure on council rates by refocusing the purpose of local government, better measuring and publicising council performance, prioritising core services and council spending, strengthening council transparency and accountability, and to provide regulatory relief to councils. This workshop is broken into 3 parts to look at council's purpose and focus, then measurement and accountability, and then transparency and sharing of information with elected members. So looking at the purpose and focus, the bill takes out all of the references to the 4 aspects of community well-being. It reinstates as a purpose of local government to be focused on cost-effective provision of good quality local infrastructure and public services, and reinstates the specific core services a local authority must have particular regard to in performing its role. It's noted in here, and as other ministers have noted, that the amendment is intended to encourage local authorities to adopt the sort of financial management principles that a rates capping system in New Zealand would be intended to foster. And the Minister has said that there will be further information about that later this year, and that he'll be taking a proposal to Cabinet before Christmas. So as provided in the pre-reading, we've set the current sections of the local government out against the proposed changes so that you can see directly where the changes would occur. And here is deleting the subsection with the four well-beings, adding in the requirements about good quality local infrastructure, local public service, and performing of regulatory functions in the purpose of the Local Government Act, changing the definition of community outcomes to also reflect those changes. And in the purpose of local government, taking out the four well-beings, adding in those points, and adding in a further point that the purpose of local government is to support local economic growth and development by fulfilling the purpose set out in the paragraph above. There is also the new section 11A, which is where the core services are listed, and notes that this must have particular regard to, council must have particular regard to the contribution that core services make to their communities.
I wonder if we just pause there and just check before we keep moving on in the presentation. Are there any questions or points of clarity that you'd be keen to seek about that? And just while you're thinking about that, what I'd specifically draw your attention to is that the provisions are and they're not or. So it's important that you don't look at them exclusively by themselves. You've got to look at the cumulative combination of that definition around purpose. So it's not just to enable democratic decision making. The and has to be added, and the and when we start thinking later on about what that could mean, it's just important that when we think about definitions, how definitions come together in a piece of legislation. Clear as So when if we think about the grey areas, so if we go to 11A, where we've got the core services to be provided in performing our role, the A, B, C, D, E, so network infrastructure, public transport services, waste management, civil defence, libraries. Obviously, there's a number of services that are not there, that what this Act, without a broader definition, would do, would paint it in the grey area for debate, and probably for the courts to battle it out, about whether something is a function of council. So let's use, for example, the provision of economic development, or the provision of community events. The definition, if council were to consider whether that is a core service, it must also go back to the purpose to determine whether it enables democratic decision making, meets current and future needs of communities, and to support local economic growth and development by fulfilling the purpose set out in paragraph B. So you could take some of our, maybe economic development's not the best example to use because C will probably meet the definition, but if we used investment in community events as an example, or investment in environmental, let's take the Climate Change Action Plan and the fund associated with it, you've got to come back to these definitions to check that it confirms against the purpose and not just a core service in itself. And there'll be, if something's not listed in A to E, the Act doesn't provide a mechanism for councils to seek clarity on whether something is a core service. What it essentially sets councils up to do is be judicially reviewed and go through a court process for case law to determine precedent on whether something is a core service or not.
So that the criticism of that as it stands is that this bill is too loose and not prescriptive enough to avoid that kind of process, which will put a further cost on ratepayers. Is that what?
Oh, look, I think that's one thing, that there's potentially an unintended consequence here, that it, like if councils have a view that something is important and the ratepayer wants to invest in it, that if it's not clarified as a core service, or if it doesn't meet the definition, how do councils have confidence or not that they can invest or not? Because I'm sure all councils want to avoid expensive court processes, because that's not in the best interest of the ratepayer. The point I was more making, Mike, was just like it's really easy for people to just look at bullet points here and just look at them in isolation, but you can't look at this in isolation. You've got to look at how it comes together. So, for example, the provision of museum services. So that's a core service under the Act. But it's not just a core service in its right. It's a core service because it has to enable democratic local decision making and meet the current and future needs of communities and good quality infrastructure, etc., and support local economic growth and development by fulfilling the purpose. The assessment of what that is and whether it meets the efficient and effective test, like there's more layers of detail that's going to need to come out through the select committee process on that.
So I guess just stepping that through in terms of and specifically I'm looking at libraries and museums, because it's an and effect, this direction doesn't ensure or define councils to provide libraries and museum services moving forward. If it actually, those services don't fit the future needs of the community, that arguably future councils could change its libraries, its community facilities, its museums appropriately to de-invest if in future it appears as if those services are no longer valued or required by the community.
So I think a good example would be waste management, right? So where you go food composting, and so you might say, well, on its face, it's a core service, but does it meet the limbs of B and C? Because is it the most cost-effective for households and businesses? Potentially, you could argue that it's not, because this is an alternative, right? So, or that it's to support economic growth and development, and so that you're going to have to tick a number of boxes, even if on its face it might appear to be within the scope of the core service. You're going to have to drill down into those things under Section 10.
And I think we've got to bring this back to the policy objective. So what is the government trying to achieve? And it's about cost of living concern. It's about the impact of rates. And so they don't want just councils to go back to core services. They want confidence that when councils are delivering core services, that it is the most efficient and effective way. Now, what the current Local Government Act, the mechanism for them to demonstrate that at the moment is the Section 17A reviews, which this bill removes the requirement for a Section 17A review. So it's still keeping that onus there around efficiency and effectiveness, but it's probably creating a stronger drive by putting it up into the purpose of local government rather than it being an outcome of local government.
Because you have to have something like Section 10 that accompanies Section 11A, because some of those things, like take a library, it's not the library physical bricks and mortar. It has programs, it has activities, and so the qualifier of Section 10 might mean that you can have a library, but the scope of the activities that the library or the programs that the library could have are constrained or tempered by looking through the lens of Section 10, right?
Correct. And obviously the note that Caro emphasised before is that this amendment is intended to encourage local authorities to adopt the sort of financial management principles that a rates capping system would foster. So while this bill doesn't introduce rates capping, it is sending a very clear signal to councils around treat it as if you were needing to cap rates. By the way, by Christmas, I'm going to bring something to Cabinet about how I'm going to make councils do that anyway. So it's a really strong signposting from the government.
Well, so I think this is actually a really good piece of work, and us probably support it 100%. And I'm sure there's a lot that won't. But I think this is an opportunity for us to really explore more content and more detail, and we need to really, like one issue is not going to fit all councils, and I think as we go forward, there's probably councils out there that probably really need some of the stuff to pull themselves back. I'm not saying in our instance we're in the same boat, but I think it's a good opportunity to really get into some of that detail and give feedback on that. And that if we support this, but we actually need to know what A, B, and C is as a consequence, because that's where the grey area is going to be, especially when we have those conversations with the community.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Paul said pretty much exactly, apart from the devil being in the details. But then local government, I think, has developed the capacity to interpret legislation to kind of suit its agendas at times anyway. But generally speaking, I'll just leave that there. Generally speaking, I think if we were to support this in principle, we're sending a really good message to our ratepayers that we're actually on board, because the spirit of this thing is really good from my point of view. And, people are struggling out there.
Great. Okay, if we keep going, the next part just highlights how the discussion that we've just had ties the financial management approach with the purpose in that section 11A, so that it is all joined up when these considerations are being made. So, just looking quickly at what else we know, the bill does actually describe what good quality is. So in terms of good quality public services and infrastructure, and the performance of regulatory functions, it means that they are efficient, effective and appropriate to present and anticipated future circumstances. They haven't amended in this bill the status and powers of local government, so it still does enable a council to undertake any activity or business or do any act or enter into any transaction. So that part is unchanged. And as mentioned, we don't know the detail of rates capping at this point. So here we've jotted down some questions and welcome your additional questions as well. So here, looking at whether these proposed changes are likely to meet the objective of the bill. Do these proposed changes provide the clarity for you about the expectations of councils? What impact, if any, does this have on the functioning of councils? And the question, what impacts will rates capping have in addition to these proposed changes? So whether you have comments or feedback about any of those, or any additional questions that you might like to raise that have been sparked by this bill.
Obviously, when we get to the end of the presentation, ultimately what we're seeking is your direction about A, should we make a submission, and B, if so, what should it say? But off the back of your feedback, Paul and Mike. I think one of the things that would be a helpful conversation for elected members to have, and this is based on a conversation I've had with some colleagues, is like the government have a clear intent and objective, and community, right now there is an affordability crisis. There is communities are hurting, just as you described, Mike, and lots of the conversation across communities around New Zealand aligns with this idea of councils getting back to its core. It's unlikely that council's submission to a select committee process is going to influence government's direction of travel. And that's not me cautioning you against not making a submission, because I think that it's important that the voice of Horowhenua is heard through this process. But what I'd encourage you to think about is, if you were going to have an impact through this process, what is the impact you want to have? And how I've heard it being described is that it's about the definitions. So it's about the definitions of when we go to back to the new section 10 and 11, are there particular words in there, or is there specific definitions missing where it's like, actually, that's the bit we want to advocate for, or that needs further refinement, because that is where I think Select Committee will put its attention and focus. It will be on some of the errors that need to be fixed in the bill, because they might have missed some bits, which I think Karen might mention shortly, or are there some particular bits when we look at that, and if we think about what our community tells us is important or not important, or if we think about in 10 years' time and we're sitting around having a debate about a particular provision of service, what's not in those definitions, or what is in those definitions that need further thinking so that we don't get caught out in detail.
I know you want to go through the presentation, but all I was going to say is that I agree. I think it's definitely around definitions, but it's also probably the lack of a I don't want to use catch-all, but for example, I would add a 1F, which that says any other service or activity authorised by the minister, something like that, so that it allows for the minister of the day to authorise at a multi-TA level or an individual TA level an activity that might currently be outside those definitions, because there may be things that where you can essentially put up a case to the minister and say, well, it just makes sense for council to do this because there's our council to do this because there's no one else to do it, or if it doesn't get done, if it's not provided by council, it won't get done, and here's the business case for it, here's the return on investment, whatever. So it's kind of like a catch-all or a mechanism to allow for permission-based addition to your core services.
I think that I think that's something council should definitely think about how they could support or encourage that. Because one of the things that's come to mind for me is if we think about our current financial strategy and where some of our conversations probably need to go into around long-term fiscal sustainability of HDC, our lack of investment is one of those things that in a future financial strategy council might want to consider. This really restricts council in terms of that idea of having any investments to offset rates. So if we think about the policy objective of trying to take pressure off ratepayers, a potential any investment options for council would probably be quite limited through this, and that might be something that council's okay with, but it's also probably a good example of an unintended consequence where it could restrict council in the future.
Yes, because you sort of need something around that. If there's an aspect that's cost neutral or better, that we've got the lenience to do it, and that could be the conversation, like Sam's saying, Sam something around that. But I mean, and there's certainly some examples of councils out there that do, a lot of work in this space to reduce the rates burden, right? So yeah, how we can craft something around that as well, cost neutral or better.
What do others think about that?
Yeah, just picking up on Sam's. I like the catch-all, just in case there's a project that is unique to Horewhenua, and we would be able to do that. But again, that's also around the lack of investment, because eventually once we sell off our assets, what's left to alleviate the cost of living that's placed on our ratepayers?
The thing too is, so all these, I can't help but think in some ways it's going to sort itself out. In a rates capping environment, if we literally don't have the money, well, if we can't afford a library, we're not going to have one because we don't have the money. And I'm saying this for 3 years, we are broke. When we talk about investment, I mean, it's all about just cutting our cloth, really, I think. And this is just it's an opportunity to actually demonstrate that by supporting it in principle. I mean, sure, there is detail in here, like what Sam says and everyone else is adding to it in terms of, whether we can get tied up in something and we can't, we've got no wiggle room. But apart from that, yeah, I don't know. It's just an opportunity.
Monique, I kind of feel like the government with this policy is cherry picking what it wants councils to do. So we like economic development, so let's take that out of the four well-beings and let's add it as a option C to categorise that. But the wider concern for me is are they confident that by removing the requirement for environmental concerns that the other regulations and legislation that we need to adhere through the upcoming RMA changes and stuff like that is adequate enough to provide those environmental concerns to be fully considered and funded. What worries me as well is that we've got a policy legislation that's changing what local government needs to do with the intent of reducing costs. But it also comes with no discussion or any ideas around how the funding mechanisms for councils could change or could be alleviated to actually provide that financial solution moving forward that would enable councils such as ours to operate more effectively and pass on lower rate rises into the future, because we've seen an appropriate adjustment to that funding mechanism. Again, it's a populist policy, because if you, similar to Wayne Brown, if you ask anyone if they want lower rates, 80% are going to say yes. And this talks to the intent of keeping rates lower for longer. I'd also question if they've done any significant costings relative to the financial savings that individual councils would deliver through defining these scopes down. Because essentially what they're saying is we'll cut the community out of the legislation. We will encourage councils not to invest into community programs that have a positive influence. And so when those councils stop investing into programs that benefit the community, what is then the cost to the community? And then who funds that cost? Because if council's not doing it, does the community do it? In some cases, the answer is yes. But then the next question is, does the cost then fall on central government? And so are we then in a scenario where we end up funding it through central government and not through local government, and we actually aren't seeing a cost change? We're just seeing a change in who pays that cost for that provision. And that's the piece that I haven't heard any commentary on in terms of the intent of this policy, the reality is it will mean a whole lot of projects and a whole lot of funding that's focused in and around community development and community well-being would stop, whereas the analysis around what benefit that would deliver to the taxpayer and the ratepayer as a result of that.
Yeah, those are questions I can't answer. And those sounds like questions that either you or council want to ask of the government. Can I just, I think it's important to, like, I understand that there'll be strong feelings and emotion attached to this, particularly for those that really advocate for the wellbeing staying in the Local Government Act. Now, remember in 2002, the 4 wellbeings were removed from the Local Government Act, and like lots of people talk about it but nothing changed. Then the wellbeings were reintroduced to the Local Government Act. The difference here is that the way in which this legislation is being crafted is that it builds some risk. It creates risk for councils where they would not change anything. The bill, as I read it, is not saying it would be unlawful for councils to not deliver to deliver non-core services. But what it sets very clearly is this expectation around financial management, and that financial management must solely be focused on Section 10 and Section 11, which comes back to purpose, which is those words up there. But there are some things in the Act that still send a signal that I don't think they just want councils to provide. I was about to use the word public toilets, but then we could get into a debate about whether public toilets fit into the definition of core. So it's, Section 14 of the Act is going to have a replacement where it replaces Section 14(1)HI with the social, economic and cultural interests of people and communities. So that is still a principle of local government. This is what I'd encourage councillors to think about, is that this is the signposting for actually the next piece of legislation. The next piece of legislation is the rates capping legislation, because there is no mechanism in this that holds councils accountable other than the court of law. And I think that is an unintended consequence that, my advice to you is we've got to spotlight that to the government, because that's going to cause further cost to the ratepayer when councils fight the mission in court about whether something meets into the definitions. It would be far more suitable to have a mechanism whereby the minister or a group of ministers or a department had some sort of power to agree that something was a core service or not, rather than giving. And you might have a different view on that, because you might think that actually, no, that's the power of democracy, that people should be able to challenge this stuff in court. That's probably a principal conversation for council. This is a big deal, but it's not as big of a deal in the absence of a rates capping legislation. It's when when the two pieces alleged combined, that's the cumulative impact.
So just to confirm, we have nothing about what the capping will look like. So we're to make a decision over here, and we're to throw a balloon in the air and hopefully it comes down and lands safely with the capping. Okay.
Yeah, we don't, and this is a little bit of what Clint was referring to, is this is one part of the jigsaw puzzle. Now, rates capping is another piece of the jigsaw puzzle, but let's not lose sight of the other pieces. yesterday's announcement around building consent reform. A couple of months ago, the announcement about Resource Management Act reform, the decision we've made about water services. It's the cumulative impact of all of these changes and how we, the community, survive and thrive through that change. This is a systems improvement bill. It's not the Future for Local Government bill.
And I think that's an important consideration, is that if you look at Section 10, it doesn't mean that other enactments aren't going to confer roles and functions on local government through those enactments. So, like, there'll be still a role potentially in the Resource Management Act context. There'll still be a role in regulatory space, so the Dog Act, and so the exhaustive, it's not an exhaustive list in Section 10 because there are other things that can affect or that will be relevant and set the overarching picture.
That's right. And in the regulatory impact statement, they've listed the 47 acts which also require local authorities to perform functions. And there's a further 19, so a total of 66 in total that enable councils to do things as well. So this is one piece.
For example, the regulatory impact statement still talks about council's requirements under the Climate Change Response Act. It still talks about council's responsibilities under the Gambling Act. Still talks. So, yeah, but what this is doing is providing council the steer on the direction of travel. I suppose the question for you is, you either make a submission to government that says, yeah, we get it, or, yeah, we get it, but we don't like it, and we want to forewarn you about unintended consequences, or, yeah, we get it, or you don't say anything at all.
If we go with, yeah, we get this and we're on board, I don't see that we've actually got anything to lose here. I mean, the spirit of the thing is good, and I've just said that, but the community is going to look at this and go, oh, my council doesn't support this, so they don't want us to have lower rates. They just want to keep on spending money. So in terms of the public perception of us getting on board with this, I think there's a lot to be gained from that. The downside is I don't see too many downsides because as Monique's kind of laid out there, this is just a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. We don't have all the pieces, and you could, a cynic would say this could be part of a bigger plan to basically disestablish or unravel local government itself, and that wouldn't be a surprise to me at all. So in that sense, I think we've got, and getting lost in the detail about, oh, well, we like this, but we don't like that. I think we should really have got much more to gain here in a real and perceived sense by just supporting the spirit of it. It's my view, anyway.
Thank you. If we step through the other two parts as well to raise the issues which are addressed in the bill as well, we move into measuring and publicising of council performance. So in the Local Government Act at the moment, there are groups of activities which are listed in the bill. They'll just be shifted out into regulations. It expands on the existing regulation making power to enable benchmarks to be set in areas of council activity beyond financial performance and asset management, would require councils to report on contractor and consultant expenditure, and makes the issuing of rules for performance measures by the Secretary of Local Government discretionary rather than mandatory. The rationale there is to improve the consistency of council planning and reporting across all councils, to give members of the public a better sense of what good looks like in terms of council performance, and to support a review of the current non-financial performance measures in light of new planning and reporting requirements for water services proposed through Local Waters Done Well. So
this is, if we think about the service benchmarking report that was released a couple of weeks ago, this is just bringing into legislation the continued focus around service benchmarking. This was my advice: is I don't think we have anything to fear here. This is yet another mechanism, albeit there's already plenty of other mechanisms, but it makes it more readable mechanisms around transparency with community on council performance. Is anyone uncomfortable or has a particular view on the measuring and publicising of council performance? Might take some pressure off lobby groups because the government's going to do it for them.
I think it sharpens the pencil and makes us aim for success. And I'm not saying we're not already doing that already, but again, I think there's some councils that really benefit from this and being put under the torch. So.
It will be interesting though, in terms of some of those reporting measures, things like reporting on contractor and consultant expenditure. I mean, councils will find loopholes to hide things probably as well, but I don't know whether that actually serves much purpose. That we know that we pay Tartners or Higgins or Green by Nature a certain figure. What does that prove if they're doing different things? Like the benchmarking at the moment, the context of the data can be completely different for one council from another. So, I mean, I don't have any issue with actually doing it, but it just, again, the context of what is, the nice words shift the specific group of activities council must plan for and report on into regulations. I mean, what the hell does that mean? It seems, setting benchmarks is great. I don't have a problem with that at all, but these are just words. It's about how the implementation of what they want us to measure and how they want us to do it. Or as we've seen, the benchmarking data is news for about 2 days, and then everyone starts, talking about something else. So I don't see how it proves a heck of a lot, to be honest. I don't think the community are looking at it, other than the Taxpayers Union.
And the third area that we're looking at is transparency and accountability. So in the bill, this sets it up so that the Secretary of Local Government will issue a standardised code of conduct and a set of standing orders. Both would be binding on all councils, and the idea is that there is one code of conduct that applies nationwide, one set of standing orders that applies nationwide. Is there?
Do we not have that currently?
No. So and look, it's all, most councils use a template from LGNZ, but some councils have a casting vote for the mayor, some don't. Some councils allow elected members to zoom into meetings, some don't. There is one council in New Zealand that has no code of conduct because the council refused to adopt it. Rotorua District Council, just in case you weren't wondering. I know, nerd that I know that. It is that while there will be some similarities, there are inconsistencies. So would that be a general, some general feedback? Yeah, it makes sense.
Well, certainly the rationale in the last two statements, I definitely agree with that sort of thing.
What the objective.
Yeah, support the rationale as to why they're doing it, for sure.
Probably a big one around.
I think even if we look at attendance, being present is probably if we could streamline all that across the country, I think that's important. It's probably a lot of a grey area for some people.
Again, it's definitions. What does effectively represent local people on council mean? I mean, that's not just about turning up to a council meeting every week, but what does it mean in terms of public participation or whatever? Does that represent that? So I mean, are you allowed to be a councillor from the other side of the world and not do it? So again, the definitions are the key.
I think the just on the National Code of Conduct and Standing Orders, the bill says it will be provided, but what's not provided is obviously, so what would that Code of Conduct say and what would the Standing Orders say? And so it's if there's general support for that makes sense. My advice is that part of our submission, if we were to make one, is more about requesting at the right time input into that process. And look, there's already a piece of work being led out by the Local Government Commission on the Code of Conduct piece, standing orders. This isn't new stuff. I think it's been well traversed about what are the issues or what are the opportunities with streamlining this work. But you would be supporting something where you can't see that those standing orders yet. You can't see that Code of Conduct yet. But maybe it's the spirit of it that you're supporting.
Agreed. And also, what does information sharing to you mean? I mean, what does that look any different from what we currently get? Because to me,
Yeah. So these provisions, you're talking about the information sharing provisions. So that has come about off the back of some particular instances around the country where councillors have requested information and it's not been provided by their chief executive. And you might recall a particular case south a couple of years ago. Challenge you to find an example of where you've not received the information you've requested. But there are some council...
Some elected members have to use the Lagoima to get access out of their council and their chief executives.
Yeah, and some chief executives
related.
refuse to provide information to their councils on things.
It seems in New Zealand we create laws for that one or two instances that happen, and so we have to create a law for it.
I think what it's seeking to do, though, and it doesn't worry. I think all it's seeking to do is protect an elected member from having the ability to have access to the information. And when the chief executive say no, it's giving the council a legal mechanism to say, well, no, actually you have to. I don't think there's anything to fear in it.
The other question I had was around the freedom of, or the responsibility of elected members to work collaboratively to set the direction. I mean, does that mean that the Code of Conduct will be sufficiently strong enough to actually to either give some consequences for those that actually don't work collaboratively together? I mean, is that what the intent of that is? So if you could actually say if someone is out of line and doesn't act collaboratively, then there'll be consequences for that. It seems a bit.
Look, we don't have the detail of it yet. What I would say though, and this is just my crystal ball, and I'm wondering whether it's some signposting around the predetermination. Around, how elected members under Code of Conduct and Standing Orders, elected members never come to the table knowing what they're going to vote because they always have to come with an open mind. I'm wondering whether this is trying to free up some of the shackles on elected members in the lead up to decision making, which is quite different to how our local MPs, MPs can say what they want before governments pass law, versus councillors are always reminded by their chief executive to keep an open mind before they make a decision. I think it's something about the lobbying and the expression that councillors share ahead of a decision. That's my guess.
Is it fair to say it kind of doesn't really matter in terms of, whatever is up there or whatever it's changed, we're still going to be sitting here going, well, what does that actually mean? Because I interpret it this way and you interpret it that way. So in some ways, and also I think what you said before, Monique, is that in a real sense, this is not going to change what the government's going to do, or it won't do anything to affect human nature either. So if I know it's kind of sounding like I'm saying, what's the point? And in some ways, that's kind of is what I'm saying in making a submission to this. But if we accept that whatever our submission is, it's going to have little effect in changing any of this, why don't we just go with the one that's going to be most positive in terms of, the spirit of the thing?
Views on this,
Specific section or
or
Mike's
just
comment?
broadly?
Well, I agree with Mike's assessment. So I'd be looking for. I think we should do a submission that says, broadly in support of the direction of travel. Where I probably slightly diverge from Mike is that legislation or good lawmaking should be certain. It should provide certainty so that you don't get into those interpretation challenges. And so that's probably the space I'm in, is that there's some elements of what's proposed that could benefit from some clarification or enhancement. So as an example was the kind of catch-all or some sort of authorising ability. I wonder if Section 10 should also expressly reference regulatory activities under another enactment or something like that. So, because I think it would be useful to capture that there. I think that the language in Section 10E, which is the libraries, I think that's too loose. Like it needs some further definition of those terms, because as you reference, like public toilets, I would argue, for example, that something like a library or a pool, they're not necessarily a core service of council. They might be a discretionary thing that a community might decide. Because, for example, like if you're on, does this now mean that it creates an expectation that those are facilities that must be provided? So I think there's definitely needs some tightening of the language and some definitions to support particularly 10E. The interesting thing about the Standing Orders Code of Conduct, agree with in principle the spirit of it there, but I agree with what your advice to us was that we'd like to be involved in the shaping of that. And I think there also needs to be an ability to amplify or add to those. So it needs to be a legislative ability, because there are times, and we see it through our own standing orders, where we might want to add something that helps us work as a group, as a governance table, and so not allowing council to go in a way that is inconsistent with those or goes directly contrary to what the standardised set of standing orders and code of conduct might be, but actually just add or amplify, I think, is what I'd be looking for. And the last piece was, I agree that there's some things that we currently do that would, on their face of it, become not core services, but there's probably some grey area where, and I don't think it's through the submission that we'd seek clarification on this, but we will need to work out the treatment of them. And so, like, there's things, for example, like we hold a lot of property, we hold forestry, we hold carbon credits, all that kind of stuff. And so, on its face, those things wouldn't be core services, get that. But what's then the treatment, or what's the expectation or mechanism to exit out of those things, or yeah. Kind of needs to be some sort of thinking around transitional arrangements for some of those things that might not be core services that you might be doing, and sort of like an exit process.
I wonder whether what the government's intent is that when they roll out rates capping will apply to non-core services, not core services. That's just what I wonder. Like, I don't know, but that's some of the sentiment I've heard. But in section 101 of the bill, which is where it talks about, ultimately this is about determining council's financial management approach to council business, it talks about having the overall impact on any allocation of liability for revenue needs on the community. Now, I think what that is trying to say is councils can still deliver non-core services, but where it's going to have a liability, like when it's going to have a revenue, when it creates some liability ultimately to the ratepayer, that council will have to give regard to section 10 and section 11, which brings it back to purpose and core service. So, which is kind of why I raised that idea of investment or revenue generation before, because I don't think the bill is intended for councils not to do that stuff, but it is saying councils should not do that stuff if it's going to compromise council's ability to deliver core services, or councils are having to fund that from the pockets of those who need to fund the core service. But this all comes back to, as you say, Sam, good law is clear, and there are parts of this bill which aren't necessarily clear about how it all comes together.
The only thing I'd add to that, though, if good law is ever really clear, then why do we need lawyers?
To argue that it's not clear.
Yeah, because people don't like them.
Yeah, because that's an interesting one. And just going back to that code of conduct and standing orders. If standing orders comes out as an instruction that you can't alter, and there is they give the mayor the casting vote. How does that actually sit when we don't have it and have never used it, and all of a sudden we're forced to actually have that? And so, those sorts of things, and there may be other things that they make us do that might not necessarily fit the local situation. And I struggle with that a little bit, that we can't determine our own set of standing orders. Sure, they need some refinement and upgrading, but why do we have to be told how we should be behaving? Why can't we decide that ourselves? And I'm sure, because no one here agreed with me having the casting vote. So if it all of a sudden became the issue, I can see how difficult that would be around the table.
So what I think the government would say, and I'm not saying this, I'm just expressing what I think the government would say, is that there are too many examples of dysfunctional decision making around New Zealand, and their desire to bring one set of standing orders to hold every council accountable. But I think they would also say that it is about getting communities to better understand the decision-making process of councils, and by having different approaches, that kind of transparency piece for communities to understand the nuances between councils on, casting votes is one example. That's what I think the government would say, but I might be wrong.
Just in saying, I'm obviously reasonably supportive, but how can we communicate through a submission that we want to be actively involved through the process. Like, is it at council level or is it above that? I'm not suggesting LGNZ, but what other vehicles have we got to try and have those conversations? CE level.
I think that we could highlight the importance of government and DIA continuing to work with councils. I think we'd want to advocate that they were engaging with membership bodies like LGNZ and Taituara, but we'd also be wanting I think maybe you might just more want a sentiment expressed that they can't do this in isolation of not talking to elected members or councils around the country that have lived experience of this stuff. Did anyone read the LGNZ draft submission? Too much? Yeah, so there was, acknowledge your perspective on that, Mike. There were some particular sentences that I think align with some of the things that have been raised today. So, for example, you might have read the bit where they are raising the concern around the lack of definition potentially creates risk around further cost on the ratepayer, and it talks about we currently have quite a litigious environment. Let's not, and that directly links to the concern that we've raised around can we be clear about who's going to figure this out, because we don't want to spend any money or time in court. Councillor Jennings, you raised something before around the definition around Section 10, 11, whatever it was, and I kind of referenced public toilets before, because actually I reckon the courts would have a lot of fun deciding whether public toilets currently align with the definition, versus if you supported how LGNZ are proposing it, where they're saying actually add the word public amenity, because if you add the word public amenity, it starts to encapsulate some of that stuff. You might have a view that actually that makes it too broad, but there is some broader stuff in here around the definition piece and the unintended consequence piece. There's also something in the LGNZ submission around the building bipartisan support around this. I think the last thing local government wants is to get being the merry-go-round of what's core and what's not core, a little bit like the water services stuff. If the government was to change in 18 months' time, do we really want to have to go back through a process of once again debating our purpose, or would we rather the government try and... Those are just ideas for you to think about that you could... I felt like they were non-controversial things in the LGNZ submission, where it was it can still support the spirit of it, but it's just pointing to these particular things that the select committee might want to give consideration to.
The thing that worries me about the whole thing, to be honest, Monique, is the fact that we're going to have this improvements bill, and then 6 months later we're going to have a rates capping bill. Surely there has to be some alignment with the two, because the purpose of the rates capping bill is to do exactly what the intent of this bill is to do. So I just don't get it that they can't do the two together.
Well, it's because they need to be seen. To be sending a very clear signal to communities.
So we're wasting your time.
Well, but let's remember there are some provisions in this bill that help remove some cost right now. So Section 17A reviews, there are some quite little bits and pieces. I'd love for there to be a broader conversation about the system and future of local government, and it to all be resolved in one act, but that's not where we're at. But we can provide some commentary in our submission about recognising the bill's not going to achieve this, but really imploring the government to, with urgency, have the bigger conversation about local government sustainability.
I reckon that's a really good idea. I mean, if we just go with, Bernie says, like, is there any point doing it at all? But what if we just went with, a really strong statement about supporting the spirit of it, and then what you said, Monique, of, about, well, anyway, it sounded
Sustainability of
yeah,
councils.
the bigger conversation, because but if we make a submission that's anything like LGNZ's, it's just pages and pages of waffle, no one's going to care, and it'll just come off sounding like, oh, we're opposing it. So I think it's a really simple, strong submission supporting the spirit of this, and making some statement about him, which is true. It's in the best interest of all our communities. And then just add into that we think it needs to be considered as part of a larger conversation about the future sustainability and funding models of local government or something like that.
Can I? Sorry, Nina. Can I? Kara's written that, and that's pretty easy to package that up. Can I just test? So earlier on in the conversation, Clint, you raised. I don't know if it was some concern, but it was kind of curiosity around, well, remove the well-beings. What about that stuff that our community says matters? And I've kind of talked loosely about, well, in the absence of rates capping, we're not sure whether we'll still be able to do it. It's probably under what financial mandate we get to do that stuff into the future. I then referred you to, while the full well-beings have been removed, there is going to be there is still the language about the principles relating to local authority, referring to the social, economic and cultural interests of people and communities. So is there, I don't know if there'll be consensus around the table on this, but was I hearing from you, Clint, a concern around, well, why does the government get to decide and why doesn't our community get to decide? Or not?
But also the unquantifiable cost of removal of that, because it's all anecdotal that this will drive rates down. Whereas I think that when you look at the draft proposal from not from LGNZ, or sort of from LGNZ, the Taitora draft, the challenge is infrastructure costs are the true driver of cost increases, rather than the community wellbeing costs. So it's how do you measure it to sell the story? And I'm not smelling the sizzle of the sausage in terms of it being clear and confident that what it intends to do will.
I saw facial expressions react to that,
Yeah.
but is it something about a very short paragraph at the beginning of our submission that describes our context at Horowhenua District Council, an average 9.1% rates increase, 85% of that is waters. If you're not connected to waters, you've probably had a rates decrease. Is there something about that would give you a bit of comfort that doesn't necessarily say exactly what you've said, but it leads into the story around, hey, our increases haven't necessarily been driven by non-core services. Our increases have been driven by core services. No? I'm not saying that's what you should say. I'm trying to help the table build consensus on this.
Monique?
Yeah, I would agree with that. If the
I was wondering whether there's an element as well of just saying that if we're broadly in support of the direction about reducing rates, the work that Council has been doing to reduce rates, the focus on it in the long-term plan, and then the rates which we have had recently adds to that context, and then you could go into the specific points about the bill if there was support.
Well, this is how I picture the submission in my mind. Really strong opening paragraph that says we support the direction of travel, the spirit. Then we're basically saying an overview of some enhancements or some improvements that we suggest, and then we have a appendix that has all of the detailed commentary about specific wording things and with suggested solutions. So not just saying this bit sucks, we're actually saying suggested solution, whether it's some definitions of terms or suggested text, kind of similar to what LGNZ have done, but without the, as Mike said, there's just too much stuff there. Because fundamentally, I think what we are saying is we kind of do support the prescriptive approach to defining services and core services, but we want more certainty. We want clarity around the parameters. Because, as an example, the example of that whole public toilets thing is a good one, because on its face, it's really clear that you would argue that is a core service. Like, I think you could make a reasonable argument for that. But central government doesn't trust local government, because you've got Wellington City Council spending $2.4 million on flash public toilets with fancy lights, and it's an architectural masterpiece. And so I can see we're going to have a real challenge in trying to define some of those things, because there's an expectation around delivering stuff, but in a kind of bland, boring, basic way. It's not about all the bells and whistles and fluff.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up a word that's been bandied around this morning. The word spirit. In the spirit of the document, I have a document that's really important to me, that it's not important to others. So to say it's in the spirit of, I wouldn't agree with you saying that. So if you find another word to use.
I completely agree with you, Nina. I mean, the idea of the spirit is entirely subjective to whose ever idea of what the spirit is. So, I don't have a problem with your idea of it or mine.
I think the government language to use would be around the objectives. So the objectives is around taking pressure off ratepayers.
That's where I have a little bit of a thing, that section 10 where it talks about decisions that need to be cost effective and in the best interests of people and businesses. Does that mean that we don't trim the trees? Does that mean that we don't find a solution for the landfill? Does that, because it's not cost effective? Is that the reason then that you make a decision as to whether it's the absolute level of decision making? Is it cost effective? Because that would then give everybody the excuse, well, it's not cost effective, so let's not do it. And that's where, again, I think the over-prescriptive parts of the intent of the bill could have unintended consequences in terms of what it might allow us to do or not allow us to do. And is that then the decision making around the table becomes a question of it being cost effective or not, or whether it's the right thing to do for our community? And that's where I have a slight sort of dilemma in terms of the spirit of the bill.
Yeah, look, Mayor Bernie, Section 10 is, emphasises good quality, cost effective, support local economic growth and development. Like, it's clear the intent that sits behind the objective.
Sorry, just a question, Monique. So does this affect, is this retrospective? So, like, you've brought up the landfill. Now that's going to cost us for many years. If this was to come in, would that affect, because it's not cost effective, but it's required.
The bill is silent on transitional arrangements, much like the Resource Management Act reform. And yeah, what do I think? I think that councils can't get out of binding legal agreements or binding decisions that have been made, but councils will need to shift its focus around future decisions and future long-term plans and annual plans to reflect this. One of the things Caro has raised is it's not clear, like, when does this come into force and the planning cycles for councils, because I think that's one of the things that we're all waiting to understand is if rates capping legislation goes to cabinet by Christmas, like, is it real by 1 July 26 or is it real by 1 July 27? What does that mean in terms of cycle of government elections, and what does that mean for the cycle of long-term plans? It's all kind of those are the things that swirl around in my head around how do we be prepared and get ready for this. So I think seeking clarity through the select committee process on implementation is something that would be of merit to all councils.
Can I just read you Mayor Wayne Brown's comments that he gave to his council on this, talking about this, and particularly about the code of conduct. He said, "Where are you? How dare you post us a letter and tell us we've got to behave? It's insulting. I'm quite prepared to put in there that we'll form a group here for a code of conduct for their behaviour and send it down to them and see how they like it." Well, exactly. And this is what he's saying. Here they are telling us how to behave, yet they can't behave themselves. Yeah.
So one of the really positive things that has come out of the bill is the minister has kind of directly responded to some of the consistent things he's heard from the sector around quick fixes that make a difference. And so this is about like public notices in the paper, Section 17A reviews, an interim chief executive being able to sign legal documents, because at the moment they can't sign specific lending documents. Clarifying third-party contributions for capital projects, and so this links a little bit to development levies. There is a change where it removes the requirement for councils to consider the relevance of tikanga Māori when appointing council-controlled organisation directors. So we don't currently have a CCO that necessarily applies to this, but for some councils where they have lots of CCOs currently, they must consider the relevance of tikanga Māori. It also allows councils to extend the maximum length of a chief executive's second term to 5 years, so that what it's doing is then making it the same as public service commission appointments. Do council have views on any of them, and is there anything you want to make a particular point on in your submission?
I don't really have too many issues with what's there, but what I think is not there is the requirement for annual plans, long-term plans, and also audit requirements. They're not answering any of those, which tend to cost us massive amounts of money. A long-term plan costs us $1 million, basically. So there has to be some rationalisation or somewhere along the line, a look at how we deliver our planning documents and and the way that audit operate.
something around that. While we note the government's focus on greater efficiencies, the biggest difference that could be made is around the audit and regulatory requirements on councils during annual plan and long-term plan requirement processes, which is consistent with what everyone has been saying forever.
But just on that, Molly, when we go back a little bit and we look at the transparency around, you could effectively say benchmarking against our peers, then we shouldn't need some of that anyway. Because effectively we're being audited to do just that. So if we're going to be open and transparent with our information and document it publicly, then we're doing it.
I think the other factor is we're going to lose our water services in a couple of years' time. Again, does network infrastructure, in terms of the core services that we provide, I assume that's incorporated into that. So does that mean the law is going to have to be changed? And when we all...
So we're still responsible for the delivery of water services. Remember, under the Water Services Delivery Act, councils are still responsible.
Even though we've got no control.
You do have control. You appoint
point of board.
And remember, some councils
are going to be doing it.
Are going to be, for now, delivering water services still directly. We're still legally responsible and liable. Anything specific on the regulatory relief piece other than audit, which we can spotlight? Before we talk about antisocial road user legislation, I've not heard we shouldn't submit, we don't want to submit. I've heard we've got to say something. We don't want it to be a long, lengthy document. We want it to be clear that we support the objectives, but to spotlight some concerns around lack of definition and unintended consequences.
And sort of focus on solutions, we need to put something forward to say we think that this would make it better.
Seek engagement in future decision making or future development of things like code of conduct, standing orders, but really make the point that, thanks for the steer government, but actually what we need you to put your attention to is the long-term future sustainability of councils when you account for the cumulative impact of multiple reform programs.
On the code of conduct standing orders one, we can probably just deal with it real quick by saying we support the LGNZ submission on that, because they kind of it's pretty much spot on. We might just have a sentence or two that just says basically what we want to do is retain the ability to have some ability to supplement or amplify or something. I think it's that kind of language that it's over and above, or as Mayor Bernie said, at the moment when we adopt the standing orders at the beginning of a term, we have choices within the actual document, and we chose on how motions are to be moved, all that kind of stuff. And so maybe it's some magic around an agreed set of standing orders or agreed code of conduct that allows some choice of options within it. Yeah.
So long as the headline in the Horowhenua Star goes, HDC endorses thoroughly government's drive to reduce the burden of rates. And the whole thing's on no more than both sides of an A4 piece of paper.
Make the font real small.
Anything else on that? Could I at this time just remind the table that our policy says that because we're in pre-election period, that I get to decide the final submission.
Who are the idiots that signed off on that policy?
Those councillors that have high trust in their chief executive. And so what that will look like is it means we don't bring it to a council meeting, but we will draft something, we'll distribute it, we'll provide councillors an opportunity to hack it, and then we will, similar to the approach we took last week with the housing growth submission, we then kind of just make a call internally where, on balance, where are we going to land. In your legislative tracker notification sheet you got last week, we obviously highlighted this, and it felt important that we just spotlight this for councillors, given the relevance for us off the back of our two incidents this year and last year around the boy and girl racer weekends. And so I'll get Kara to speak to this at a high level. I probably don't want us to spend too much time on it. We just want a quick steer. Mayor Bernie's initial advice is, we need to talk about this.
Great. Thank you. So, yes, at a very high level, the purpose of this bill is to deter antisocial driving behaviour that negatively affects road and community safety in New Zealand, including fleeing from police, illegal street racing, dirt bike gatherings, and frightening or intimidating convoys and excessive noise. How they will do this is by giving police and the courts greater powers, as well as creating some new offences and strengthening penalties associated with those behaviours. The submission is due on the 30th of September, and whether you're happy for or would like council to make a submission on this bill or have any other questions.
I do have a question. The frightening or intimidating convoys. Now, I think I know what they're trying to refer to, but I also know, being in a quite long tangi procession, it can be seen as quite intimidating. So I just want to be clear about what we're referring to when we talk about frightening or intimidating.
Just have a quick look, but we could note that point if council does make a submission.
Yeah, I don't think it was intended to capture that, but what I would note is there has been media attention on some particular communities where tangi convoys have been associated with gang activity, and I think the intent behind this would be to address some of those concerns. So you think about like Opotiki was kind of a big focus for a while.
Yes, I think we should submit on this. I'm sure that there will be plenty of people out in the community making sure that we support this legislation. I particularly want to emphasise about the increased police powers. The fact that they can then close roads or public areas, or to issue infringements failing to comply with closures and things, is the one piece of the legislation that I particularly like. I also wonder whether we can extend it to, in terms of things like beach activity. I'm thinking particularly of the Foxton Beach dunes, and with the dirt bikes and things like that, and those sorts of special reserve areas, and give more powers to people to be able to try and stop that activity. That's my particular angle.
Yep, I'd echo those same sort of words. I think as governors for the district as such, we need to show some leadership here. It's pretty important that we don't tolerate that sort of behaviour. And I think by giving police these powers, it doesn't enable them to have a better response going forward, especially if we see the same sort of behaviour taking place again. So 100% support it, and I think it's important to submit and show them our support.
Anyone hold a different view? Okay. no different views around the table? Otherwise, we'll proceed with the submission on that basis.
I was going to say, I just think Mayor Burney should be the face of the submission. I think we usually sign them. I know it says the policy says you would sign them in the spirit, but I think it's important that Mayor Burney is key part of the front of the submission because of the recent media attention, and I think that it would be a good opportunity potentially to speak to the submission as well, just because I think that we have experienced these issues. As a TA, we kind of want to be seen to be leading on this as well as really supporting police and the call for more tools in the toolbox to fix this issue. So I think, I think we should be endorsing. Yeah.
There's nothing to say the office of the mayor can't sign off on the submission. It's just the chief executive approves it. And I'm not hearing any different views other than consensus on this. So, yeah. Okay. That was all we had for you today. Thank you, councillors. Thank you for your calm input into an important topic.
Well, David's got